I'd like to welcome you as we celebrate Women's History Month 2016. On behalf of the Women of Wallops, I'd like to welcome our colleagues at Greenbelt who are visiting here today, especially Margaret Bennett, who is the director of the EOPO. And I'd also like to thank Commander William Edenbeck from SCSE. He's the executive officer there, for joining us this morning. And anybody else who's participating remotely. Today's program is being co-sponsored by the Women of Wallops and the Women Advisory Committee with support from Wallops Exchange and Morale Activities. There's cookies out there. If you miss them, you can get some on the way out. This month, the month of March is designated as Women's History Month and is set aside to celebrate and reflect on the contributions of women. President Jimmy Carter issued the first presidential proclamation declaring the week of March 8th as Women's History Week back in 1980. And then starting in 1987, Congress designated the whole month of March as Women's History Month. And every year since then, the president has issued a presidential proclamation declaring Women's History Month. This year's theme is, and this is according to the National Women's History Project, is working to form a more perfect union, honoring women in public service and government. Many outstanding women have made outstanding contributions and achievements to this country and to NASA, and that includes the Women of Wallops. We're engineers, we're clericals, we are resource analysts, we are project managers, professional admins, scientists, technicians, leaders, and learners, and contractors, and civil servants. We've hosted health fairs, panel discussions, lean-in chats, lunch and learn sessions, networking events, mentoring activities with local students, and the list goes on. And together, women here have made, and we look forward to continue making, great contributions to America's heritage and prosperity. And with that, I'd like to introduce one of our own who started at Wallops and now works at Greenbelt, and that's Joy. She's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Pam. Well, it is kind of good to be home and see some of the faces that I'd seen before. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I am the Women's Advisory Co-Chair. I'm an outgoing co-chair. I'd like to first recognize Raquel Marshall, if you'd stand or at least turn. She's the incoming 2016 chair for the Women's Advisory Committee for Goddard. And we are Goddard. We are all Goddard. The women of Wallops, all the women at Wallops, all the women at IVNV, all the women at GIS, and Greenbelt. We compose the Women's Advisory Committee. We have representatives for that. And moving forward, we'd like to talk a little bit about building relationships. Going forward, we plan to put in place a women's community of practice where we hope to focus on developing meaningful relationships and just what that means. Hopefully we'll get a little bit out of Mitzi's presentation to understand what we can do to improve it, what we can do to improve our relationships and environment in the workplace, and more specifically to cultivate a culture of equality. That's very important. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Mitzi. If you look at your program, you see that you have a biography there. I'll mention a few of the highlights. Mitzi has so graciously come to join us today to celebrate Women's History Month. And she is a science writer. She's quite accomplished in her own right. She's currently the corresponding editor for the Academy of Women's Health and also for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News. It turns out she's an author. She's authored a few books. She's a rice farmer in her background. She wears many hats. She's also been one of the U.S. delegates to the United Nations for the Conference on Women in Nairobi. And she's also a former commissioner for the U.S. National Commission on Libraries and Information Science. More specifically, Mitzi is also a resident of the Eastern Shore, and she founded the Healthy U of Delmarva, a 9,000-member organization that encourages healthy lifestyles through awards for outstanding workplace wellness programs. Mitzi is probably most famously known for her late husband, Frank Perdue of Perdue Farms. And she's also benefited by being a daughter, a mother, and a wife. As most women do, they have multiple hats besides just being in the workplace. So I'll let Mitzi tell you a little bit more about her leadership lessons and about things. I'll let her tell that part of the story. What I'd like to share is how we are all benefiting from relationships, specifically generational relationships. Mitzi's here because many, many years ago, through the kindness of her heart, she and Frank opened up their heart and their homes to their growers. They had poultry growers, as they're called, broiler growers. And my grandfather happened to be one of those growers, and she entertained him and my grandmother on several occasions in their home. She did not know me, but through that relationship, my mother, who was a history teacher here at Arcadia High School, had invited Mitzi to speak at the Black History Month program. And that's where I first got to know of Mitzi. Well, roll the clock several years later, I'm a co-chair with the Women's Advisory Committee, and we needed a speaker. And I asked my mom about it, and she said, well, yeah, just send her an email, just reach out. And I don't know about many of you, but I have a problem with saying networking because it sounds so formal and like you're doing something to get something. But I reached out, and she remembered. I sent her a picture, and she accepted the speaking engagement at Goddard. So we had her as a speaker for Women's History Month last year. And as a result, we are all benefiting from that generational relationship building because she's here now to speak with us today. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Mitzi as she shares her lessons with us, as well as brings to us her version of women's history for this today.
Joy, thank you so much for that introduction. I want to add my side of it, which is, yes, I remember your parents, and yes, I remember Arcadia, but you said that you were a little bit hesitant about sending an invitation to me. Oh my gosh, because of your mother, how could I conceivably say no? But then the other side of that is, I was so honored and still so honored that I hardly know what to do with myself to be included in a NASA event, because I grew up pretty much like a lot of people, pretty close to worshiping NASA. I mean, you wouldn't guess this, ladies and gentlemen, but you are in the presence of the president of the Rocket Club for high school. So I grew up just loving NASA, but it's also pretty much in my blood because my father was a Navy test pilot back in World War I, and he was an MIT graduate. And so between engineering and science, and it's just in my blood to absolutely love everything you do. And Joy, when you gave me that invitation, I mean, I was doing mental cartwheels. I just loved it. And then when you invited me back a second time, I'm grateful and honored and thankful. In our time together, I'm going to be talking about something that in the meet and greet a few minutes ago, we were all talking, and it wasn't network, it was relation building. And I realized as we talked about that that's honestly an awful lot about what I want to share with you today. First of all, this is still on the theme of being ecstatic to be here. I've told you about my father and about the Rocket Club, but Wallops enabled me to give my grandchildren one of the best days ever. And the thing that you see over there, my grandson there built a rocket out of Legos at the Wallops Open House. So anyway, as you can see, I'm a big fan of Wallops. You may notice that I'm wearing green. Of course, it's St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's is just so appropriate for Wallops. I wonder how many of you know that he's the patron saint of engineers. Raise your hands if you knew it. Woohoo, I'm glad you didn't. Let me tell you why he is the patron saint of engineers. Back about 1,500 years ago, actually it was 1,600 years ago, he was living in Ireland. He was a very erudite man, and he knew a lot about architecture and engineering, and he's the one who brought to Ireland the Roman Gothic arch. So it's very good that today's St. Patrick's Day and that I'm sure that he belongs here. Next, the two gentlemen that I'm going to be talking about a lot today, Ernest Henderson, he was the founder of the Sheraton Hotels, and Frank Perdue, founder of the Chicken Company. They have something that I regard as kind of an amazing coincidence of what they have in common with NASA. I was looking up, and NASA today has roughly 22,000 employees. My father and husband both had 20,000 employees. So when you have an organization that large, a lot of the success of it has to do with the human relationships, the human resources, the kind of thing that makes people willing to go the extra mile, the kind of thing that makes people willing to stay with an organization for a long time. And both of them excelled at it, as does NASA. Well, on the subject of having people engaged and ready to go the extra mile, there was research done recently by Gallup. Gallup surveyed people, and they asked, and this is worldwide, how many people, when they come to work each day, feel fully engaged? They love what they do, they're anxious to come to work, they identify with who they work for. Worldwide, give a guess how many people are fully engaged with their organizations. And I'm going to ask you by show of hands. So, and please be responsive because you don't want a speaker who feels demoralized, so okay? How many think it's 13%? 33%? 62%? How the heck could anybody know? Which I consider a really enlightened answer, but the next great guess question. In the United States, and this does have a different answer from the question I just asked, how many people are fully engaged in the United States in their work? 18%? 33%? 85%? How the heck could anybody know? Well, the answer, according to Gallup, is, first of all, it's not D, because Gallup in the last, since 2000, oh my, is this still working? Ladies and gentlemen, we are having what's called a wardrobe malfunction. But we're all friends. Gallup surveyed, since the year 2000, has surveyed 25 million people in 160 different countries in almost 140 different languages, and they found out that worldwide, only 13% of the workforce really loves their jobs. In the United States, it's 33%. However, in NASA, let me talk first about why you want engaged workers. They're responsible for most of the innovative ideas. They stay twice as long in their jobs. They take 10 times less sick leave. They have a 31% rise in productivity. Now, where does NASA fit in all of this? 76%. You rate top out of all federal employees and for pretty much all employees in the whole world, which is a pretty extraordinary thing, in view of which, why am I standing up here telling you about ways to have people more engaged when you already are the absolute winners? And the answer is Mitzi's law. My theory is that the real winners, the best of the best, are always eager to find more. And in view of Mitzi's law, I am going to try to share some things with you. You probably know some of them, but maybe you don't know all of them. And my hope is that by the end of our time together, that you'll have some ideas that you can really use. And part of it is, for the success of an organization, is it the horse or the jockey? I think it's the jockey. It's the direction of it. And I want to share a story about my late father, Ernest Henderson. Ernest Henderson, he started with one hotel in 1933. At the time of his death, he had almost 100 hotels, and as I said, He had 20,000 employees. You don't get that kind of success unless you have a lot of ability to develop relationships with people who will stay with you and who will go the extra mile. How did he do it? He created for people a better vision of themselves. And how did he do that? I'm going to give you an example from his life. When Father would take over a hotel, the first thing he did on the first day that he owned the hotel would be he'd invite all the employees to come into the hotel's ballroom. And I think you might be surprised how many people work for a hotel, but take a typical Sheraton hotel, the Sheraton Park in New York, 800 employees. Well, all of these employees, on the day that Father takes over, they're a pretty demoralized group. The hotel, generally a hotel doesn't come up for sale, and which means that he wouldn't be buying the hotel unless it was in financial trouble. I mean, they're discouraged, the employees are discouraged, they're demoralized, and they're very concerned, are they going to keep their jobs? Because, you would expect, and what happens with many of his competitors, they do a house cleaning. It's a failing hotel, we need new people. Father would come and stand in front of the hundreds and hundreds of employees, and he was a shy man, so this was difficult for him, but he believed in it so much that he made himself do it. Father would announce right at the beginning that every person there was going to keep his job. Father would go on to say that he knew that the success of the hotel depended entirely on the employees and their willingness to make it a better place, to give it their all, it was them who was responsible for success, and that his entire job was to create the conditions where they could show what a good job they could do. And then he'd give them a picture of what the future held. And by the time he had 3 or 4 hotels, he could speak with authority on this. He said, this hotel is going to excel. And he had such a track record of, when he'd buy a hotel, it would do well, it would become popular, and with that he had the money to buy more hotels. Well, he'd paint a picture for the employees of what they could do and how management was there to help them be all they could be. And then, this is the first day, the first thing that he would spend money on, the first thing that he would invest capital in, was refurbishing the hotel. But it wasn't refurbishing the guest rooms. The first thing that he did was he would get the chief decorator of Sheraton, it's a woman named Mary Kennedy. She would go in, she would inspect the rooms that the guests would never see, and she would arrange for the refurbishing of, for example, the employee dining rooms, the employee bathrooms, even the shower heads. The shower heads, by the way, were exactly the same ones that would be used for the guests. So were the commodes. The locker rooms, everything was upgraded, painted, decorated, because his view was the most important part of the hotel. The guests were extremely important, but number one, upgrading the hotel, or upgrading the part for the employees. And the result was people stayed with him for life. The hotels, the only reason that Sheraton grew, he started in the depth of the Depression. The reason that Sheraton grew and that he could turn them around was the way he treated the people who worked with him. And he didn't say worked for him, it was worked with him, because he regarded it as an entire team. So, I would like you to spend just a couple of minutes, divide yourselves by 2, and if it comes out unevenly, make it 3. I'd love for each of you, and scrunch up if you need to, which is, by the way, why I wanted you all to sit close to each other. Share with each other an example of when somebody said something to you that made you have a better vision of yourself and what it meant to you. And this is in the overall theme that Father had, that people have a complete compulsion to either live up to or live down to your opinion of them. I mean, he built his hotels on the theory that people live up to your highest expectation of them, that by creating a better vision of themselves, that they will become more. Okay, I'm going to, on the count of 3, invite you to divide up and just talk with each other for a couple of minutes about a time when somebody, maybe a teacher, maybe an employer, maybe a parent, said something along the lines of, I believe in you, and the difference it made to you. Go for it. I get to listen in.
Yes. She had shared her college experience with me, and I thought college was a big thing. I was saying how my mom had instilled in me by grade 3, by 3rd grade. So I was going to college. I didn't know what college was. I knew I had to do well in school, but that was my goal. So even though I didn't understand, later I began to understand. So I took pleasure in getting good grades because that was what was required. Right. Yeah, it was fun.
I get to listen in.
So for me, it was my 7th grade math teacher. And he was 8th grade. 7th grade math teacher.
Ladies and gentlemen, would somebody like to share? And if you share, there is a participation prize. Tell me somebody who would share when somebody really made a difference to you by believing in you. Yes.
I actually had a boss that worked for me. He was a man that actually.
Oh, wait, you know what? Let me give a mic for you.
I actually was very young coming out of high school, and it was a male supervisor who actually saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, because I didn't come from a lot of money, so I couldn't afford to go to college, and I didn't really have a counselor of anything or anyone that told me that, hey, you can do this if you're smart, you can do this if you put your mind to it. And it was actually Bob Erickson at the Department of Navy at Dahlgren Naval Weapons Center that saw it in me and said, if I can make a way for you to go to school, will you go back to school? So that's what happened to me.
Okay, great big applause for her. And you're now in charge of distributing future ones. Well, my late husband, also, by the way, thank you so much. I loved that, because that's a true example of living up to what people expect of you. And I recommend to everybody else, when you think of what it's meant to you to get somebody who really sees the best in you and believes in you, do that for others. Pass it on. Now, with Frank. Frank, like Father, also built something from, in his case, it was a father and son operation, to one that at the time of his death was close to 20,000 people. And we do sell in 113 different countries, so he built something enormous. How did he do it? Well, one of the things Joy mentioned, and that came about because when Frank and I first married, we had just returned from our honeymoon. And it was 1988, August, and we're walking along the beach. It happened to be in Watch Hill, Rhode Island. And there we were, kind of romantic, early in the morning, not many people around, and carrying our sandals, and we're walking along the beach. And I took him by surprise by saying, Frank, I think we should entertain every single person who works for the company. Well, yeah, his reaction was pretty much what yours was. It was, no, that would be 20,000 people. That's an impossibly large number. Well, I pretended that I didn't process that no, and I said, I think we should have them 100 at a time. No, that's just way too many people. And I told him, well, let's start next end of September. No, that's way too soon. And then I told him, let's start with the secretaries. They're everywhere in the organization, and they can tell people that our parties are fun and not scary. And Well, this went on for several more rounds with me saying how we were going to do it and him saying no, and me acting as if I just didn't process no. But as we kept talking, his attitude began to change from, this is crazy, to maybe there's something to it, to finally, I like it. The reason for his change was that initially, Frank's reaction was negative because he was, you might not guess it if you've seen his advertisements, but he was a very shy man. And the idea of having hundreds of people in his home was just way, way, way outside his comfort zone. But on the other hand, as he thought about it, he realized that it would be an additional way of showing the people who worked for him that they were important to him. And so it was that 6 weeks later, and beginning with the secretaries, we began what was almost weekly for close to 17 years, as long as we were together until his passing. We began a series of dinner parties, and we really had everybody, whether it was truckers or veterinarians or accountants, and certainly the secretaries, because we started with the secretaries. Well, at these parties, Frank was such a good host, because one of the things that he'd do was, say there were 100 people and we did invite them in groups of 100, he would talk with every single person there. And Frank had a gift for making people important. When he was talking with somebody, that person, was just enveloped in his caring and his attention. And he was just gifted at that. Another thing that he did was, we had a large buffet, and he would stand behind the buffet table along with some waiters, and he himself would serve the people who were his employees. And I'm standing back watching this, and I'm thinking, how many heads of Fortune 500 size companies would actually wait on their employees? And then at the end of every evening, he'd stand up in front of his guests, who were his employees, and he'd tell them that he knew that the company wouldn't be what it is today without each of them. Well, I know that these parties were just very, very important to the people who came, and I know this first of all because they'd tell me, but second of all, I would attend funerals over the years where over and over again I'd hear the same thing. A close relative of the deceased would tell me that the most moving thing in the deceased's life was being invited to Frank's home. Now, I felt that these parties, surely they were important to the people to the guests, but I also knew that they were very, very important to Frank because Frank was a deep believer in culture. He told me once, and I wrote it in my diary, that one of the most important functions of a leader is the culture that they create. Well, he wanted a culture of appreciation, recognition, and respect, and for him this was a way of doing it. And one of his reasons for recognizing how important it was Frank was a deep believer in a quote that I'm going to give you. It's a quote from William James. And William James said that the deepest principle of human nature is the craving for appreciation. And Frank knew how to do it. And these parties were part of it. And as I watched him, through the rest of our 17 years together, I got to see over and over again that showing appreciation, recognition, and respect were just a deep part of what he did. It was that relationship building that Joy was talking about. And he did it in other ways as well. One of the things that we did continuously, would do this pretty much every weekend, while other people, where our friends might be, watching TV or playing golf or running errands or whatever you do on a Saturday, I'll tell you what the Perdues were doing. We were visiting people at PRMC. Frank would get a list from his administrative assistant, Elaine Barnes, of who was at the hospital and would go call on each one of them. And what must that mean to an ill person? And this could be somebody who was 8 levels down. But if they worked for Perdue, he was very likely, if we were in town, we were very likely to call on the person. Another thing that he did that I'm just so proud of and that was so meaningful because to my mind it was above and beyond, would visit retirees. On these Saturdays, after we'd finished the hospital rounds, would go and call on people who were retired. And the message there was that you're an important human being, that I care about you whether you're getting a paycheck or working for the company or not. If you've worked for the company, I really still care. And again, the message that sends, I don't think he did it to send a message. I think he did it from, sincerely from his heart. But it did send a message that the whole of you is important. And I have a deep belief that loyalty is a two-way street. And he loved the people and cared about the people who worked for him. And I think that's one of the big secrets of what made people stay with him for their entire careers. One of the things that he did that I thought was exceptionally brilliant, and I want to keep an eye on the time because I'm a deep believer in being on time. One of Frank's great gifts, and it's one that's available to everybody here, is he was incredibly good at listening to people. And among the things that he did, I will explain that. It does have a meaning. One of the things that I heard over and over again was, if you worked for Frank, and maybe you're in a group, and he's come in maybe to solve a problem or something. One of the attitudes he had was, none of us is as smart as all of us. And he didn't have and I heard this from people that I interviewed for a book I wrote on him. I interviewed 134 people, and this is something that just came up over and over again. He said, or I was told, that when Frank would come into a room, it's possible to be the great big leader, 20,000 people work for me, Fortune 500 size company. But instead, his attitude was almost humility, equality really. Because again, if you've got that attitude that none of us is as smart as all of us, his gestures would be small, intimate, like a teammate, rather than the great big flamboyant CEO. He did not use up all the oxygen. And that brings me to another point, which is the 90-10 rule. I observed this in Frank our entire 17 years together. Frank did not talk so much as listen. If he was with you, he might ask you some really pertinent questions, but in general, he'd be listening to you. And I have a theory on listening, which is that it's almost right up there with I love you as far as making somebody feel important. Truly paying attention to somebody does make them feel important. And it creates a warmth, it creates a relationship. And Frank was enough of an egalitarian that whether he was talking with a bus driver or a bartender, a receptionist, whoever he was talking with, that person had his total attention, and he would be listening, not talking. And the fruits of that, I hear that to this day. I can be, in an office, maybe in New York or wherever, and I keep meeting people who, even 11 years after his passing, remember even a brief interaction with him because he made them feel important. When Frank was talking with somebody, and I want you to listen to this part particularly because there's going to be a little exercise, ladies and gentlemen. It involves you're the only person in my world. When Frank was talking with somebody, he had a gift that I don't come across all that often, which is, and I mentioned it earlier when I said that when he was talking with people at our parties, that at the moment he was talking with you, most important person in my world. Well, when Frank was talking with somebody, I guarantee you that every atom of his being was just focused on whoever he was talking with. He wasn't thinking, what am I going to say next? How am I going to answer to it? How can I bring up what I want? Or what time is it? Or no. When he was talking with somebody, that person had every bit of his focus and attention. And I think it made people feel like on top of the world, because to have total attention, as I said, it's right up there with I love you for making a person feel important. And something else that Frank was a deep believer in is that how you your importance or your status or whatever else, or maybe these wonderful things that you've done, they don't really count that much for how people perceive you and respond to you. In his view, how people respond to you really is how you make them feel. And this is something that he'd coach me on. He'd tell me, say we had been to some fancy party where, really famous people whose names I could drop. He'd say, don't do that, because that would make the person you're talking with feel less important. And that's not what you want. You want to make the person you're talking with feel important. Frank was very, very good at accepting dissent. There's something that I'm really fond of. The person who argued with him most bitterly was a guy named Don Mabe. He'd tell Frank, even in staff meetings where there might be 10 or other people there, he'd tell him, that's a terrible idea, you should retire. That was the person who dissented most and argued with him most was the person he made president when he retired. So Frank was a big believer in respecting the views of other people. He loved it. Well, he didn't tolerate yes people, and he loved it when people would argue, and he would change his mind. It might take a lot of doing, but he was famous for being willing to listen to people and change his mind. And I think that has a huge impact on how people feel about where they work. Because imagine two boss situations. There's the boss who he comes into the room, you know what he wants, and you have to bend into a pretzel trying to figure out what he wants and saying, yeah, let's do this. I think that's demoralizing because you're not true to yourself. On the other hand, you have a boss who listens to what you say and is willing to pay you the respect, first of listening and occasionally changing his mind if it was a good enough argument. I mean, that just does so much for a person's sense of self-worth and connectedness and feeling valued. Frank was very good about encouraging dissent. Now, the listening experience. Let's see how much time we've got for this. Ladies and gentlemen, you have already once divided into twos or threes. I want you to do it again. But this time, I want each of you to think of something that's important to you. Maybe it's your children. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's a vacation. Maybe it's a movie that you just loved. Have in mind something that you really care about and that's important to you, although I have a preference that you don't talk about politics. Ladies and gentlemen, divide into two. Decide which of you is going to tell the experience that's important to you. The others of you get to be jerks. Your job is maybe to look at your watch, maybe to look at the program, just in one way or another, maybe interrupt. Be a really jerky listener. And then after that, we'll come to part two of the great listening experiment. Ladies and gentlemen, divide up, decide who's going to be the speaker, and practice, for the listeners, practice being a jerk. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, congratulations, you all did a beautiful job. But now we're going to reverse it, and you can decide among yourselves whether you're the same listener is the same and the same speaker, or you can flip it over. You get to decide. But we're going to have roughly a minute of flipping it over the other way. Okay? On your mark, get set, Be a good listener. If you're a listener now, you're a good listener. No, you get to do it. No, I'm just listening in. Ladies and gentlemen, actually, I'm happy that you're so involved. I've got a little comment for you. My comment for you is, when I asked you to stop being a bad listener, boy, you just stopped instantly. It was kind of like 10 times as long to get you to stop from being good listeners. Now, you've all experienced at this moment jerk listeners and great listeners. Would anybody care to share how it made them feel, if they learned anything? Yes.
Well, I learned that
That's because Pam's a nice lady. I already know that.
yeah, she is. But while she was doing it, I just sort of kind of went with it. She asked like completely irrelevant questions, and I was like, oh yeah, no, I don't have a Fitbit. Yeah, I like oysters. Right, so it was really interesting. And then she wanted a chance to redeem herself, so she did quite nicely.
How did it feel being a good listener?
It was much more interesting.
Thank you so much. 2 participation prizes. If anybody else would like to comment on how they felt. Participation prizes, ladies, gentlemen. Well, in which case, a summary. We've been talking about successful cultures aren't an accident. We're going to have some time for questions, by the way. Successful cultures aren't an accident. Both my father and my late husband were deep believers in culture. I mentioned earlier that Frank Perdue said that one of the most important jobs of a leader is the culture that he or she creates. My father, this was back in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and I don't think they even talked about culture that much. I don't think it was like part of the radar. But he was very, very aware that the leader casts a long shadow. Both of them were deep believers that people either lived up to or lived down to what you think of them, and that your job of a leader is to give people a better vision of themselves. I feel, again, it's, to use an expression that's a little bit out of date, but it's kind of carrying coals to Newcastle, to give people in NASA any advice of how to behave, because you're already the global winners of doing it wonderfully. But I do believe that giving people a better vision of themselves is one of the best things a leadership culture can do. Thank you all very much. And now, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
First, thank you so much for giving your time. I'm curious, what's the most important relationship in your life today?
As in right now? You. But in addition, no, at this exact moment, nothing in my entire universe is more important than being here with NASA. But since I'm going to guess that wasn't what you really meant by the question, let's see, let me give you the most fair and honest answer that I can. I really love my work. I love communicating. And I've just spent an entire year with the National Speakers Association has a course that they give. It's 8 hours once a month, and it's like 40 hours of homework for each class. And so I guess public speaking is something that I really care about. And I care about it because I've got a message that I want to share, and I love doing it. So that, I guess my relationship with work is the most important. On a personal level, it's my children and grandchildren. But thank you for the question. Participation prize. Any other questions? And by the way, I'm up for any kind of question if you want to ask what Frank was like or anything at all.
Well, since you brought up grandchildren, I think this opens. I
Go
have
for it.
5 granddaughters, and I love your involvement in science. So if you could give them one piece of advice to try and encourage at least one of them to be a world-renowned scientist or strongly in science, what would you tell them?
Having 4 grandchildren and having exactly the same goal, I'll tell you what I do. I have created what I call grandmother activities. And tell me the ages of your grandchildren.
18 down to 8.
Okay, 18 down to 8. Mine are a little bit younger, but maybe some of them could benefit what I'm about to describe. I've created what I call a family newsletter because although I have 4 grandchildren myself, I have 22 great-grandchildren courtesy of Frank. And I want all of them to be scientists because I think it's such a great life and I love it. And you know, trying to expand the universe of knowledge, I mean, what could be better? So what I do with my grandchildren and step-great-grandchildren is I create little science experiments for them. And to make it really fun, I've actually invested, you can send away at eBay for little children's lab coats and goggles, and you can even get miniature gloves. And I have them, it starts out with them making what they choose to call plosions. A plosion is an explosion. And I have them put together, I create little plastic jars which are filled with things like acids and bases. But they're things that are commonly around in the kitchen. And they can be like vinegar or baking soda or lemon juice or whatever. And the kids get so excited putting this and that and seeing that something's happened and they've made it happen. And they get turned on by having the little costumes to wear. Well, that was the first part. The next time that they came over, we made bread, or actually we made biscuits. One that had baking soda, that had an acid and a base in it that would create the bubbles, the carbon dioxide, and one that lacked it. And they got to knead it, and there's 2 piles, one that is not leavened and one that is. Well, they got to experience what happens if you don't have the carbon dioxide bubbles coming, and they bite into the biscuit 15 minutes later, and the biscuit, nice and fluffy. They try the other one, and it's a little bit like layers of cardboard. And so we talk about carbon and dioxide, and then another one that we do. What I'm really saying is that we do a lot of experiments, and when they're dressed up, and they just get so into it because they've done it themselves. Another one that we did recently was you take a copper penny, and it's got to be real copper, not a zinc penny, but a real copper penny, it's all tarnished and it looks crummy, and you put it into water, nothing happens. You put it into lemon juice, nothing happens. You put it into a whole lot of things, but then you put salt and baking soda together, and all of a sudden the tarnish leaves. And then we talk about how this happened. Why did it not happen? And then you add salt, it does. And then we get into a discussion of there are these little tiny things in salt, and they're called atoms. And in the presence of vinegar, they'll separate, and they'll connect with the tarnish on the copper coin. And the kids just, when they get to do it themselves, when they're pouring it and doing it, and I think a lot of it is, the chance to wear costumes. I mean, because they're dressed up. And so now the kids, mine are 7, 5, 3, and 1. Okay, the 1-year-old doesn't count, but the others do. Well, I mean, she gets to listen in, and I hope there's some. But now, if you ask any of them, they all want to be scientists. So I think the play acting, I think it's sort of pushing them in that, or maybe exploring that, this is a fascinating world. It's not all just what you see. You can make things happen. And I don't know what the future holds, but I'm a huge believer that you don't leave the culture of who I am, that you don't leave that to chance, that you influence it. So that's what I do. And let's see how we are in time. Oh yes, participation prize. By the way, there are soaps and there are thumb drives. So if anybody wants a soap instead, Joy.
Yes, I've got a question. You mentioned that you're a rice farmer. That's in your background.
Oh, you can tell by looking at me that I'm a rice farmer, right?
So that's not a traditionally female career. So I wondered if you could share with us maybe a quick one of the challenges that you had in that role, being a female in that career, and then maybe how you overcame that.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I was a rice grower in California. There were 5,000 rice growers and me. No, I'm wrong. There were 3 female rice growers. And the other 2, by the way, had gotten into it by being widows. I got into it by choice because when my late father died, I had an inheritance, and I thought I could put it in the stock market, boring, or I could invest it in agriculture. And I was interested in it from the scientific point of view, because rice is the staple of most of the world, and that even small changes could make a difference. But what about being one of the few women really actively involved in rice culture? I mean, I could be in a meeting where there would be 500 men and there would be me. I have a theory of life, which I will now share with all of you, which is I'm in business to impose my reality on you and not listen to your reality of me. So if somebody said something insulting or minimizing or whatever, I didn't hear it. It didn't exist. I mean, it just didn't. It didn't penetrate. It was going to be my way. And that whole attitude my entire life has served me well. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a deep believer in being prompt, and I think my time is up. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Mitzi. That was wonderful. Don't leave yet. We want to thank you not only for your remarks, but for your dedication to the Rocket Club and being a great role model for science. So we have a reminder. You're now one of us. You have an open invitation to come to Wallops anytime you want. We'll host you and make sure that you have an audience of eager people to listen and learn. And thank you. It was wonderful. So thank you so much.
I'm completely overjoyed by this. Thank you so much. Thank you. Everybody, I love you all.